You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hahn,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Robin Cook. Hey everybody, welcome back to Author Stories for 2019. We had a fantastic year last year with more than 250 shows released, and we are on track this year for another amazing year. So thanks for listening. Go to hankgarner.com. You can find archives of all the shows, and you can subscribe there so you never miss an episode. I want to thank our sponsors today who make this show possible, and not only do they make the show possible, but they are doing amazing things. I want you to go visit M.G. Herron and check out his brand new book called The Translocator. You can find it at mgherron.com/ASP, ASP for Author Stories Podcast. A revolutionary quantum teleportation device promises to bring humanity one step closer to the stars until it fails spectacularly. Archaeologist Eliana Fisk is ripped from Earth while the whole world watches. She lands on a strange new world inhabited by a lost tribe of ancient Mayans. Meeting them, getting first-hand exposure to age-old customs and rituals, it seems like an archaeologist's dream. But what if their rituals have a darker meaning? What if the God these people pray to is no God at all? And how in the world will she ever get back home? Thus begins a pulse-pounding race against time that hurls Eliana into the great unknown, revealing ancient technologies and marvelous mysteries more outlandish than she ever imagined. The Translocator is an action-packed sci-fi thriller perfect for fans of Stargate, the Atlantis Gene, and other archaeology-inspired science fiction adventures. mgherron.com/ASP. I'd also like to tell you about Robert Cruzy's series Saga of the Iron Dragon. The first book, The Dream of the Iron Dragon, just blew my mind away. I love this book so much. The 23rd century humanity has been hunted to the verge of extinction by an alien race. Trapped 1,300 years in the past, they have one mission: survive. Space travel, Vikings, time travel. The first book is out. The second book is out. The audiobook releases in just a day or two when you're hearing this. And then the third book is out in ebook and paperback also later this week. I love this series so much. I think you guys are too. The Dream of the Iron Dragon, Dawn of the Iron Dragon, and now Book 3, The Voyage of the Iron Dragon. There's a link to it in the show notes. Robert Cruzy, Saga of the Iron Dragon. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have my friend Drew Avera on the show with me today. Drew's latest book is called Four. It's a collection of stories from his Averyverse, and a fantastic science fiction writer. And Drew, I believe you're delving a little bit into cyberpunk these days, aren't you?
I absolutely am. I actually just wrapped up this week the first draft for a new cyberpunk book called Rise of the Syndicate, which is set in my Dead Planet universe.
Sweet. Well, we're going to talk all about that in just a minute, but you've heard the show before, and we can't do anything until we answer the first question of the show, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I have two answers to that.
All right.
If you take visual storytelling as an answer, I would say whenever I was about 11 or 12, I fell in love with comic books and I wanted to be an artist. So using the visual medium was probably the first time I wanted to be a storyteller. But when I was 16, I read a novelized version of an Incredible Hulk book by Peter David. It was called What Savage Beast. And I wasn't much into reading books. Having ADHD. I didn't want to sit down long enough to really get through it. But I actually wanted to read that book. I bought it with the money I'd saved up from hoarding my lunch money allowance and stuff. And I bought it myself. And after reading it, I read it cover to cover 3 times. I was like, wow, this is amazing. I want to write a book one day. And I was about 15 or 16 when that happened.
Nice.
So what was it about comics that you loved initially? Why do you think you connected with comics more than anything else?
Well, I think it was an escape from reality for me. I got into comic books around about the same time my parents were getting into divorce, and it wasn't a very pleasant experience, like most of them are, and mine very much so was a very negative experience. But my dad would, just to get me to read, he would buy anything that I wanted that had words in it. So he probably spent thousands of dollars over the course of a few years adding to my collection of comic books. I read anything from X-Men, Batman, all the teen books, basically everything that came out on the shelves. I would save my lunch money, or back then you could go and collect cans to recycle and make money. I would do that. And I had boxes and boxes of comic books. And all the really good friends that I had, they were into it as well. So it was something that kind of became a social thing. We would read the latest issues and talk about it. And I think having something to talk about other than the things I was going through was a pretty beneficial part of my life. And it made my love for comic books grow from that.
I think that social aspect of it is something that that can't be downplayed enough. I remember as a kid, I was huge into comic books as well. And as a kid with dyslexia, that was a great way for me to begin reading and to understand story that felt like, it was not reading that was being forced down my throat. You know what I mean? It made it fun. And then of course, you carry a couple comic books with you to school, and one of your buddies sees it and he says, "Oh, let me see that Fantastic Four." And he said, "I've got a new Spider-Man. Do you want to trade?" And it becomes this whole, kind of underground culture at school and, of trading. And it's so much fun. That's, you just can't downplay that enough, where kids want to get each other to read.
Absolutely. In fact, my best friend in high school, how we met, we rode on the same bus, but me being the new kid at school, after moving, being socially awkward and a little bit of an introvert, it wasn't until I saw him walk past me with an issue of X-Force. And because I was huge in the X-Men universe, I was obviously familiar with the comic. And I immediately got up from my seat and followed him to the back of the bus, and we started talking about it. And from there, that's how that friendship grew. And then his larger group of friends were all into the same thing. So I went from being the new kid in 7th grade to having, half a dozen really good friends that carried me through high school. So it was all based on me seeing somebody with a comic book.
Love it. So, another thing about comic books is they're a great introduction for kids into science fiction and fantasy a lot of times. I think comic books have probably done more for building science fiction and fantasy fandom than just about anything else.
I agree with that 100%, especially with the success of the movie industry since 2000, when the first X-Men movie came out. I would say that really kind of legitimized comic book fandom as far as normal people who might not have liked comic books or liked the idea of comic books. It kind of brought it more mainstream. And then each year we've gotten better and better and better as far as storytelling quality and movie production is concerned.
Sure. At what point did your comic book fandom transition into getting into more novels and short stories, and what was the transition period?
It was actually when I joined the Navy. I joined when I was 17, so maybe late 16, early 17 years old. I kind of pulled back from collecting comic books as fervently as I was, and I shipped off and wasn't able to take everything with me. I was in Chicago for boot camp, and then Pensacola for school, and then I've been stationed in Virginia since 2001. But even having a permanent or semi-permanent resident, I was often gone on detachments and deployments. So bringing a comic book collection wasn't very feasible. And I found myself gravitating more towards novels because I could fit maybe 6 or 7 of them in my rack without it taking up too much space, and it would last me several days. If before I went to sleep, I could read a chapter or two and kind of escape the stressors of the workday into something fiction, and that really kind of got me through. I remember the first series that I read through completion was The Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice, and that was on my first deployment. It was right around the time that movie Queen of the Damned came out, so I wanted to see how the movie differed from the book, which was pretty dramatic. But just getting through a series of books like that was something that was very similar to comic books for me because it followed a story arc, an overall story arc. So it was easy for me to make the transition. And since then, I do most of my reading when I'm deployed. I just kind of get my rag after taking a shower, and I'll spend 30 minutes to an hour reading a book before going to sleep. And it's a nice release of stress and to kind of escape the surroundings of ship life.
So you mentioned you're in the Navy and you've been in Virginia since 2001. First off, thank you for your service. We appreciate that. What do you do in the Navy? My trade is
I'm an aviation electrician's mate, which I deal with the avionic systems of aircraft. And I've worked on F-18s. I've worked on generators. I've spent some time as an instructor teaching electrical systems for the Super Hornet. In my current role, I'm a quality assurance representative in an F-18 squadron. So I'm kind of the second set of eyes for when major maintenance actions take place on the aircraft to ensure good quality.
Nice. So you are, your job is kind of science fiction almost from what most of us experience on a daily basis.
Sure. It's, it's cool from a military standpoint, having done so many different things, because you get to see how organizations work. When you're in an F-18 squadron, it's very much like being on the set of Top Gun. All the pilots think they're Maverick, and you kind of make fun of them a little bit. But it's interesting because you get the concept of one team, one fight whenever you're on a detachment, and maybe the problem for the aircraft isn't necessarily yours, it's somebody else's, but you can kind of pitch in. And despite the stressors of that type of life, you develop family-type relationships with people.
Sure.
And maybe sometimes people look at the military and think that, sure, they're friends, but the bond for people that suffer under certain circumstances is much closer than just friendship. So seeing that side of it, and then seeing, I've been ship's company working on generators for eye-level maintenance. And that's a completely different beast. You don't necessarily have the same camaraderie, but you're also seeing how a ship is run from a different perspective. When you're part of the air wing, you go to the ship just because that's where they send you to do your job. When you're part of the ship, the safety and maintenance of that ship is now your responsibility. So you get to see a different perspective. So anytime you write military science fiction or space opera, it's real easy to take some of the things that you learn from that and shift it into the narrative of what it is that you're writing about.
Right. So you're deployed. You're on the ship. You're reading through Anne Rice and seeing the differences in the book and how it's interpreted on the screen. What was that wake up moment for you where you were like, I think I'll try this? Everybody's is kind of different. There's was it just, some people read something bad and they say, oh, I can do better than this. Or some people just get excited by something they read and like, oh, I think I'll try my hand at this. What was it for you?
I turned 30 years old, and
that gets many of people.
It does. 30 is the new 20.
Yeah.
I think my life started over again when I turned 30. I had spent years as a musician and on deployment, I would play guitar in different cover bands, and I just love playing live. But anytime you're in a band, there's a certain dynamic that people don't necessarily talk about. And there's always going to be one or two people in the project that are super driven to succeed. And there's going to be other people who are kind of like the caboose on the train. They're just along for the ride. And whenever you're the person who's the driving force in a creative project and you feel like you're dragging other people along with you, it really kind of makes you fall out of love with it. So by the time I was 30, I had quit whatever bands I was in. Call it creative differences, but really it was just burnout. I got tired of feeling like I was the only one contributing all of myself to it. And I started kind of looking at like, well, what were my goals as a kid? Like, what was the things that made me excited about becoming an adult? And, you know, having a wife and kids and buying a house and having a career, all that, I already had all that stuff. So it was really trying to find the things that I was passionate about outside of that. And the ambitions were in this order: rock star, astronaut, comic book artist, write a book. And that's kind of how I want to say the rock star thing was like a dream from when I was 4, because my uncle was in rock bands and I saw him perform on stage, and that kind of made a connection with me. And then astronaut, once I realized people were going into space when I was about 5 or 6, I want to say I was 6 when we watched a space launch. I was like, wow, that's really cool. And then we talked about how I wanted to become a comic book artist once I got into comic books. And then when I was 16, I read a book and wanted to write a book. So it kind of fell out in that order. And I was like, well, I've tried the music thing. I don't think I want to try again with that. So I scratched that one off the list. I'm terrible at math, and I'm already 30 years old, so I don't think the astronaut thing is reality. And then I was left with 2 things that were very much within the realm of possibilities, and that was comic book artist or write a book. So I went with what I thought would be the easy one, which is learning how to draw again. And if you've ever been successful at something and then stopped and go back, you lose a lot of the work that you had worked up to the point where you had reached success. So I went from being able to draw a circle freehanded to drawing something abstract freehanded that was not a circle. So I was very discouraged by that. And I decided that, well, if I can't draw anymore, then I'll do something easy and I'll write a book. And that was the naivety talking, because I had started a book and quit because it was hard. So what ultimately finally got me to finish one was finding out about National Novel Writing Month in 2012. And that became the birth month of my writing career.
Nice. When you signed up for NaNoWriMo and you're gonna try your hand at this, what was did you know what kind of book that you wanted to write? Did you have an idea already? Were there characters already kind of messing with your head and wanting to get out?
I wish I could say yes, but the reality was the first book that I attempted to write was going to be a fantasy. And the reason I picked fantasy was because of my love of comic books. And I always looked at comic book medium as fantasy. People with abilities and things of that nature. I didn't look at the science fiction aspect of it. And really what it is the tech stuff and the guns and all that was really fun for me for a lot of the comic books that I read. So when I attempted to write a fantasy, I got about 10 or 15,000 words into it and fell out of love with it pretty quick. I didn't like where it was going, and not knowing how to write myself out of the corner that I put myself into, I just thought it'd be easier to drop it and move on. So when I found out about National Novel Writing Month, what pulled me in was they said if you won, which is basically writing the 50,000 words within the month of November, you would receive free paperback copies of your book. I want to say it was like 5 of them.
Right.
And having something to look forward to at the end of it was kind of my motivation to start over again. And the reason I started with a different genre was because I read the rules as you had to start on November 1st and finish by November 30th. So that meant all the stuff that I'd written before couldn't be included. At least that was how I interpreted the rules. So I decided to shift into science fiction. And at the time, I was really watching Fallen Skies on TNT. And I modeled the character after one of the characters of that show. And I think I was drawing inspiration from like The Matrix and what else? Oh, The Hunger Games was really big at the time. So dystopian with a little bit of cyberpunk influence. That became the first book that I wrote, and it was called Exodus. And from there, I didn't realize that you can become addicted to something, to the creative process.
Oh, yeah.
So where my goal was, I want to write a book one day, the goal shifted from that simple task, I guess you would say, to where it became an obsessive thing that kind of drives me to have published more than 20 books at this point in about, 6 years?
That's insane.
Yeah.
That's insane.
That's what people say whenever they find out about it.
Oh, man. I was just looking through your Amazon page. You and I both had stories in an anthology, Alt History 102, that I had kind of forgotten about. What was your story in that collection?
Oh, it was the Tesla Gate.
Yes. That was a fantastic story.
Thank you. I'm trying to think. I pitched Sam Peralta something different, and he didn't like it. He's too nice to say I don't like it, but when you know Sam, you're like, okay, well, he's not excited about it, so he doesn't like it. And then I said something about, well, maybe I'll do something with Nikola Tesla. And his response had a lot of exclamation marks at the end of it. He goes, do it!
I love Sam. He's one of the sweetest guys ever.
He's a super nice guy and a very genuine person. And he'll be honest with you, but he's honest with you without being abrasive about it, which is a very, very nice thing for somebody to do with another creative person. And I want to say the story was about what if Tesla really did invent something for time travel. And I watch a lot of stuff on the History Channel. I love documentaries, and I like conspiracies. So I basically kind of mixed some of the ideas that Tesla was working on stuff for the government and what that would have been resulting in. And I was like, well, maybe he did invent something having to do with space-time manipulation. And then I found out through some research that he was friends with Mark Twain, whose real name was Samuel Clemens. So if you don't know the fact that Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens is the same person, and you're just nonchalant reading through some research, that name doesn't mean anything. But then you realize that, like, the correlation between those people is like, oh, wow. The guy who wrote Tom Sawyer was close friends with the guy who invented AC electricity. You know, that's pretty bizarre. So I basically made the story so Mark Twain hired Tesla and funded research because Mark Twain missed the family that he had lost that had passed away, and he wanted an opportunity to see him again. So that was the motivator. It was all for love, that he got somebody that was smart enough to try to manipulate time-space so that he could go back and be reunited with his family. And then, like most stories, it was supposed to end very simple, that was what happened, but then the ending of it shifted in my head a little bit, and I wrote a completely different ending that resulted in Tesla having multiple personality syndrome, and one of the personalities that was inside of him became an external personification. So, and it was actually something that I wanted to pursue more of, but I didn't really know where to go with it. Sometimes you have ideas and you have to kind of grow into them a little bit before you really know where it's going to go. And I just never reached that point with that story idea of alternate dimensions and people being able to traverse them.
Well, that's the great thing about short stories, though, is that you don't have to take it to all of its logical ends. You can kind of you can plant a seed for readers and then let them kind of see where the story goes in their mind. That's one of the things I love about short stories. You can posit an idea, you can lead them to a certain point, but then the story is kind of free to be, whatever the reader wants it to be in a lot of ways.
That's true, and it kind of takes some of the stress off your shoulders.
Sure.
For having I don't want to say a satisfactory conclusion, because you want it to be a satisfying ending, but you kind of want it to have a little bit of a tale where people think about it once they put it down.
Exactly.
So hopefully people do that whenever they read the Tesla Gate.
Well, most of what you've written over the 20 books you talked about is military sci-fi and space opera. Has this been one long continuing series, or you've got a couple of different series, don't you?
I do. The Dead Planet series, which is dystopian cyberpunk, was the first stuff that I wrote. And then I actually swore off writing military science fiction whenever I first started, because I thought it would remind me too much of work. And I wanted my writing to be an escape. What actually got me into space opera was I was on my last deployment in 2015, 2016, and we pulled into our first port, which was Croatia. Can't remember the name of the port, but I remember the country. And a lot of people download stuff on their computer so they can watch movies and stuff. But I'll be honest with you, those people are pirating like torrent sites and stuff. And being a creative person and knowing that people don't get paid for that sort of stuff, I'm against it. So I try to download things through legal means, like via iTunes. And iTunes had a thing where the first 1 or 2 episodes of The Expanse was available for free download when it came out on Sci-Fi. And it just so happened to be a little ad that I saw on Facebook for that whenever I was sitting in the mall or something, waiting for somebody to get food. And I was like, I'm going to try to download this. And I was intrigued enough by it to not want to give up on the download. And if you've ever been somewhere with really crappy internet, it takes an hour-long episode of anything several hours to download.
Right.
So my level of commitment was high. But once we pulled out to sea again, I watched the episode, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I found out later, because I became obsessed with that episode, that it was part of a book series, The Expanse. So I sent an email to my wife, because internet was really shoddy, saying that, hey, I found this book series that I want to read, and they have like a 3-book set. Can you order it for me and send it to me? And maybe like 2 weeks later, I got a care package, and it had the first 3 books.
Nice.
And I just devoured them. And life on the ship is pretty stressful, and I didn't want to go on deployment with a lot of books looming over my head for things that I needed to write. So actually, the fact that you brought up Alt History 102, that was the last thing that came out before I went on that deployment. Or it might have came out like while I was on deployment, but that was the last writing commitment that I had. And after reading, I want to say the first 4 or 5 books of The Expanse, I was motivated to write space opera. And it had nothing to do with, I think I could do it better. It was just so inspiring that I just wanted to dip my toes in it. And that's how I wrote the Elorian Wars. The first book was written while I was deployed.
Nice. For folks that may not understand, what's the difference to you in space opera and military sci-fi? What separates those subgenres?
In my mind, space opera is more character-driven, and it can have military aspects to it, but that's not the primary plot device. It's the characters in a situation that they need to overcome. And then military science fiction is plot-driven, based on military action.
More tactical.
You're going to discuss a lot more about the weapon functions and the battle tactics and things like that. Whereas in space opera, you can kind of broad brushstroke over it, and people are pretty satisfied. Where military sci-fi, if you did it, they would be very disappointed that you didn't describe how the K-bar entered the person's neck and severed the carotid artery and made them bleed out.
Right. Well, it sounds to me that that one of your first loves has been and continues to be cyberpunk. That's what you really kind of started with, and what you're returning to. What is it about cyberpunk that you love so much?
The technology. We kind of live in a society where we're very high tech, but we don't think about it. Like our cell phone 50 years ago was science fiction. When Star Trek first came out, they had the communicator where they could communicate with the ship. I'm sure had I been alive during that time, I would have seen it and be like, that would never exist. Yet now we live in a world where you can communicate with someone with a device stuck in your ear, and you don't even need to have your phone to your ear anymore, and you can have a full-on conversation.
Well, and you can have Skype conversations with the International Space Station, which is
yes,
which is about as science fiction as it gets.
But it's science fact.
Exactly.
Because we are quickly taking science fiction and turning it into reality in many regards. We have a planet in our solar system completely inhabited by robots.
Right.
I see that meme going around, so it's fresh on my mind. But we live in a very high tech society now, and I think another aspect of it is when they did the aesthetic for cyberpunk in the 80s, when they did the Blade Runner movie, and which I don't know if it really is the birth of the genre, but for me, that's kind of where it started. The aesthetic of the flying cars, which predates Back to the Future, that stuff is really cool, but it's also very practical. It's taking something that already exists and just putting a future slant on it. So having technology that is cooler and more practical was very appealing to me, especially someone that, I'm from where you live, right, but I currently live 1,000 miles away. If I had some type of device that could transport me there within seconds, that would be way easier on familial relationships.
Yeah.
And then whenever I'm deployed and I'm 5,000 miles or 10,000 miles from home, having the ability to rapidly transition from one place on the planet to another point on the planet would alleviate a lot of stress. And I think having that capability through technology is very inspiring for storytelling purposes. And, I see people in the military who are amputees, but their artificial limbs are now so futuristic where it's almost like a robotic hand that they can control using nerve endings. Like, we are to the point now where cyberpunk aesthetics from the 80s is now basically 2018 going into 2019 technology.
Sure.
It's very expensive, but where's it going to be in 20 or 30 years from now? When you think of cyberpunk as a genre being a near future situation, those cybernetic things are going to be even more developed. And even look at things like Google glasses. Like, as corny as it is, seeing a picture of somebody wearing Google glasses, like, just the capabilities that they're suggesting those things should be able to do, very much lives in the science fiction form.
Sure.
That is represented mostly by cyberpunk. So I think that stuff is just really neat, and that's what draws me to it more so than military or space opera stuff. It's the nerd in me that likes space opera.
Right.
It's the growing up watching Star Trek when it was in syndication, and then growing up with the Star Wars movies. That was what makes me like stuff with space. But cyberpunk is very much the technological aesthetic that inspires me.
So what's the cyberpunk setting that you've created, and tell us a little bit about kind of the story that's coming out of that.
Essentially, I wanted a justification for colonizing Mars. So if the living conditions of Earth were greatly degraded, and either through a surplus of population or weather changes made living on Earth too inhospitable, then you would expedite the scientific necessity for terraforming Mars. And the noble cause of saving humanity pushed that aside and realized that all the same problems that people have with government now would ultimately become the problem in the future, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And basically what I did was I went to the future, we terraformed Mars, but all the same problems came with it: an overreaching government entity, people trying to manipulate the system for their own personal gain, and just the necessities of life being taxed to the point of just for profit and not because it's the right thing to do. Essentially, like if you had to purify water for everyone to have water to drink, but you taxed it just for the purposes of building up your banking account, that would be the wrong thing to do, you know. Or I've heard the joke of people talking about how they're going to do an air tax, so now people have to pay taxes just for breathing. You know, those sorts of things. That's corrupt. And
Yeah.
I write about it because I find it interesting
Sure.
how the human condition could lead us to such things.
Right. And the technology aspects allow you to kind of open that story up and think outside of our present situation, doesn't it? And lets you kind of unfold those things to what might happen and what those solutions might be.
It does. It allows you to traverse planets. It allows you to manipulate the human mind in a more aggressive nature in order to brainwash people into control. It allows you to create weapons that are much deadlier than any handgun in the history of humanity. And then at the same time, you still are painting in strokes of humanity so that you know that someone is going to want to resist the tyranny. And you create that conflict, and now you have different colors of which to paint the same type of conflicts that led to the Revolutionary War, for instance, or just any of the conflicts going on. Like right now, there's stuff going on in France that's pretty scary. I think people that are living there are probably afraid.
Yeah, and it just erupted seemingly overnight, and we kind of take for granted the security that we have.
Yeah, we joke about. I think the anniversary of the Tea Party is this month, if I'm thinking correctly. So what was it, like 240 years ago? We
Yeah.
tossed tea into the sea as a form of protest, you know. But nowadays, protest is, you know, much more televised because we have television, and also alludes to more violence. Revolutions are bloody and nasty, very scary things. All they wanted to do was not have to pay so much taxes on tea.
Right.
And it got out of control, and somebody died, and then that became a national or international incident, considering the fact that we were a colony of England.
Right.
So all that stuff happening now is just a more modern version of the things that happened in our past that led to very brutal times.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, genre being kind of window dressing on stories that, you could tell a horror story or a science fiction story or a fantasy story or a mystery thriller. And there are all these different genre conventions, and there are different tools that characters are using to solve problems and to, all of that kind of stuff. But at the heart and the essence of all of the stories that we love is that they are human stories about the human condition. And cyberpunk, it seems to me, allows you to kind of move us far enough away from our present situation to see what we as humans will do. And maybe we can learn something from seeing how those things unfold and unravel.
Absolutely. Political commentary, when you're in the environment that you currently live in, comes across as background noise.
Yeah.
If you don't agree with the stance of that narrative, you've jumped 30 years in the future and write about something that people aren't currently living in. You can write about the same political things that you're thinking about now, but now it has more weight to it because in the fictional setting, somebody's more willing to listen.
Yeah.
Because you're not talking about whatever the political statement is at the time in the forum of dissent where people are arguing about it. You're talking about it in a fictional setting, and maybe you can actually get your point across a little bit better. I don't know if you recall the TV show Continuum on Sci-Fi, where the government was a corporate entity.
Yeah.
And corporations bailed out the government instead of, what was it? Was it during Bush or Obama when GM got bailed out? I can't remember, but the government bailed out corporations. If you just turn that around, corporations bail out the government, and now you have business leaders running your country, which is very much a factor in my Dead Planet series. The world government is actually businesses. And I came up with that concept without really realizing that it might exist in other forms of fiction. And then when Continuum came out, I was like, oh, what a novel concept. I thought of it first, but I probably really didn't. But it's those sorts of things, no one wants to talk about how Walmart is, or no, actually, let's go with Amazon. Amazon is the biggest online retailer in the world. They own a lot of stuff. They can control a lot of stuff. They can control shipping costs. They can control all kinds of things that either makes life better for everyone or can make things more difficult for everyone. And that type of power, not to be cheesy, but with great power comes great responsibility. Like
Sure.
There's a certain level of responsibility where if people are in agreement with how that business is run, people are praising it. But when people don't like how the business is run, you have very loud opponents. And if you just put that into a fictional setting, it can be great fodder for the story.
Absolutely. Drew, when's the next book coming out?
I have it slated for February of next year.
Okay.
But I'm hoping I can get the cover and the editing done so I can publish it a little bit early. So maybe the last week of January.
Nice. So just a few weeks. So that's exciting. Drew, if people are just learning about you and your work, where can they find you online to learn more about you and connect with you and dig through your massive back catalog to enjoy your work?
DrewAvera.com, and my last name is spelled Avera instead of Y.
Gotcha. Excellent. Drew, buddy, thank you so much for coming on the show and hanging out with me today. We're going to send everybody over to go see you and pick up your stuff. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. You can find archives of all of the shows at hankgarner.com, and when you're there, please subscribe. Up next is an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
The ancient building wore the severe cassock colors of a Puritan minister, a uniform monochrome of slate-gray shingles and soot-gray clapboards, its shadowed upper windows cross-hatched like the facets of a spider's eye. The second story protruded beyond the first and bore the house's only ornament, 2 gray teardrops of wood, weeping from each corner of the building's stiff upper lip. The place would have looked sinister and foreboding in its shadowed alley if not for the die-cut silhouette of a dancing sheep, jaunty above the door, and the 2 front bay windows that blazed with colorful, welcoming light. The windows were hung with orbs of colored glass on staggered lengths of ribbon. Each orb glowed with autumnal reds and delicate greens, burgundy tints and pumpkin hues, dappled raspberry and clover lime, streaked with light and weightless as bubbles over a cauldron. The shelves below offered crystal skulls and silver daggers and horny devils, Celtic chalices and woven dream catchers in dreamcoat hues. A primitive broom leaned in a corner, ready for flight, and a rhapsodic nude in bronze clutched her goat-legged lover beneath a jackal bust of Anubis. The interior of the shop was even witchier. Above a crude and sooty fireplace, a stack of brick barely holding the shape of a chimney pushed through the barn-high roof, threading ancient beams that crisscrossed overhead. Brooms and kettles and Christmas lights dangled from these, alongside Halloween costumes and Chinese umbrellas, pointy hats and bundles of herbs. Jason wandered deeper into the shop. His fingers trailed across strange bronze statuary and Aztec masks of turquoise and lapis lazuli. He rolled his eyes at the luck candles and money charms, but goggled indecently at a nude and anatomically correct silver nymph with long golden hair that reminded him of Kate. "See anything you like?" Jason jumped, turned, and jumped again. The woman standing before him was the living embodiment of every hippy-dippy counterculture type he'd ever seen. Her hair was green, her face pale and round, her doughy body wrapped in some elaborately woven ethnic garb. Her eyebrows were black and pierced in little rows, and her eyes were heavily circled with midnight blue, as if she'd been sucker-punched by an oil slick. She tapped the glass over the nymph. "Admiring the goddess, I see." She'd practically caught him with porn. "You want to hold her? She won't break. Here." The woman flipped open a glass door and handed Jason the naked figure. "See how heavy she is? You could bang her against the wall all day and barely make a dent." She waggled her eyebrows, obviously enjoying his discomfort. He checked the price tag. $700? "The goddess is a symbol of love and fertility. Don't be ashamed of desiring her." The woman's long green fingernails plucked a long black cigarette from a long red case, and she lit it. "I sense," she blew smoke and studied its whorls, "dissatisfaction in love? Yes? I have just the thing." She pulled Jason into a side room where the smell of her clove smoke gave way to the skunky aromas of potpourri sachets, tea leaves, and hanging clutches of twiggy flowers. She searched, found a little bundle, and pressed it into his hand. "This will make you irresistible. Rub it on your nethers twice a day, and love shall surely find you." Jason made a face. The bundle smelled like cow manure. He didn't even want that on his hands.